Welcome to the Wednesday edition, the fantasy edition of Three High Safeties. I am Kevin Cole. I am joined by Ian Hartitz and Andrew Erickson, our two fantasy experts. Week 3, we think we know a lot. We probably know a little bit less than we think we do. So help navigate some people with some sit-start decisions here. Ian, let me ask you, is there a player this week that you're fading versus the crowd and another one that you're high on?
Yeah, Devin Singletary is someone that I'm not actively looking to squeeze into my lineups. And pretty much the worst case scenario that we kind of thought would happen has been happening so far through 2 weeks. Zach Moss has come in and not only taken away that same role Frank Gore had last season, but he's also a threat to the pass down work. In week 1, the Bills really got their running backs involved, but kind of got back to seeing what we saw for most of 2019 in week 2, just 3 total targets to that backfield. Josh Allen had a league low check down rate in 2019. You watch him play. I mean, he's throwing that ball downfield to his heart's desires. So he's also taken off inside the 10-yard line. It's just not a fantasy-friendly offense to really enable these running backs. And when we're projecting fewer than 15 touches per game for both, tough to rank them inside the top 24 backs. So I'm looking to start those at the QB position. Mr. Gardner Minshew. We should have, given him more notice when he's talked about being disrespected by all the fantasy football analysts out there like us. But the dude's balling. He's the QB 8 through 2 weeks. Three straight games with at least 3 passing touchdowns, and now gets a banged up Dolphins secondary. I just let aforementioned Josh Allen throw for 400 plus yards. So, Minshew's been a borderline fantasy QB1 for the better part of the last season in 2 games. It's time we start treating him like that on a more weekly basis.
So a guy that I'm looking to fade is Tyler Boyd out in the slot for the Cincinnati Bengals. AJ Green is obviously getting all the looks. He's getting all the targets, all the air yards. He's popping in every buy low model that you can find out there on fantasy football. But and that's going to cause some distraction away from Tyler Boyd. So I'm worried about his matchup in the slot against the Eagles. Roby Coleman's a really good slot cornerback. And again, Boyd's not seeing the type of volume that we would have liked. He's not a upside play. He doesn't see a lot of targets downfield. He barely sees end zone targets. So for him to catch a touchdown after he dropped one last week, honestly bailed out fantasy owners. So until we start to see some of these targets shift away from Green to Boyd, I'm going to be looking to fade Tyler Boyd. And then from a player that I'm higher on, someone that was added potentially in a lot of leagues this week off the waiver wire, Jerick McKinnon for the 49ers. You got Raheem Mostert and Tevin Coleman, who are going to be out next week. So it's going to be probably a 2-man backfield between McKinnon and Jeff Wilson Jr. I expect Wilson to probably man the early down work and potentially work in the red zone. But McKinnon has enough, and he's already shown enough that he's going to be able to produce. I mean, he's already averaged over 13 fantasy points per game with all of these running backs healthy. So I would put that at least as his floor. And as a guy who can make a lot of plays in the passing game, the 49ers have aggressively targeted the running backs this season. They actually ranked number 1 in terms of percentage of targets, right around 36% to the running back position. So I like him in this matchup. The Giants are not a team that I'm afraid of, and they've given up some big plays. Just last week, they gave a big passing play up to David Montgomery. So I think if you picked up McKinnon, you need a running back this week. I think you can slot him in.
Yeah, I like those. And yeah, AJ Green is giving me some serious Andre Johnson 2015 on the Colts vibe. So despite the share there, I'm not very high on him either. A guy that I am high on for this week is N'Keal Harry. Now, the situation here is he had the fumble out of the back of the end zone. They have been passing the ball a lot with the Patriots, but if you look on a pure share basis, he is right around 30% target share. Now, there was huge production from Julian Edelman last week. We saw that he was banged up a little bit, so we'll see what happens this week. Some of that could flow to Harry. And then also, if you think about the way that they're running that offense right now, Cam Newton has 40% of the rushing attempts there. Now, that number naturally is going to have to come down. Some of that will go to Sony Michel. Some of that will go to the backfield. But I think some of that will also translate into more passing. And it could start this week. So Harry is someone who is probably undervalued starting this week. And as far as a guy I'm fading this week, I mean, it's really going to be just generally the Bucs backfield, not knowing what's going to happen. And I think some people are going to be high on Leonard Fournette coming into this week. He took over the lead back role, especially in the last few quarters of the game. He had 12 carries to Jones's 3. In those last 3 quarters, he had 4 targets to Jones's 2. But I just don't know what's going to happen this week. And I think he's a high risk play in this type of matchup. And you also have, LaShawn McCoy, who's hanging out over there. He's leading the team so far on the year in targets. He has over a 10% target share. So you have that threat also there. And with all those things together, I'm going to step away from the Bucs backfield. Not going to jump in this week. I'd rather be a week late than a week early deciding who I want there.
Yeah, good stuff looking specifically at week 3. But as we know in life and fantasy football, we want to have a longer term view more times than not. So is there a trade target you guys are kind of looking to get right now before a potential big stretch coming up? Andrew, we'll start with you.
So for me, it's a guy that had a pretty good game last week. So it's not necessarily a buy low option, but it's DJ Moore. Christian McCaffrey is left this offense, and that leaves a huge vacation of targets and touchdowns. And touchdowns have just been the thing that has avoided DJ Moore, has really prevented him from kind of taking that next step and being that guy. But I was thinking about this, and we saw last year, Michael Thomas just peppered with targets, especially with the fact that Alvin Kamara was banged up. And I could just kind of see that happening out and playing out similar to it did in New Orleans last year, where DJ Moore just steps up and is that guy. And I think that he's still attainable because Robbie Anderson has really been producing. Everyone's hyped up about, Mike Davis, going to be getting 8 targets per game. So I think that DJ Moore right now, we know he's super talented. Like, we know the talent's there. It's just been these touchdowns that have been evading him. And I think that this is the opportunity now where, hey, he's about to take that step and be a top 5 wide receiver from here on out.
I like Moore a lot, and I think the guy that I like slightly more as a trade target now, although some people are already, his name's floating out there, and that's Allen Robinson. We have an expected fantasy points tool here where we look at a player's usage, exactly where they're targeted on the field, how often they're being targeted, and we try to figure out what sort of fantasy production you could expect. Now, of course, he's dealing with a deficiency at quarterback with Mitch Trubisky there, but even with that, these are numbers that are going to have some positive regression. He's 12th as far as what you would expect in fantasy points, but he's been 50th in actual PPR scoring. They play the Falcons this week. It's fantasy goodness from the heavens when you play against a team like that. The Falcons are going to score points. The Bears are going to need to score points on the other side, unlike the Giants last week against the Bears, which just weren't really pushing them to continue passing the ball. And Allen Robinson has talent. So this is also a bet on talent and a guy who's performing like a wide receiver 4 or wide receiver 5, but he really is, on that low end wide receiver 1 range. Those are the type of guys that you want on your roster, because you don't just want someone who's undervalued. You want someone who can give you top end performance, and that's Allen Robinson.
Yeah, I think David Johnson is another guy that, could give us much higher performance than we've seen thus far moving forward. Week 1, he looked great. Week 2, not so much, but it wasn't all really his fault. Only had 11 carries and 4 targets. Texans just more or less didn't have a chance against the Ravens there. It's been a tough start this season. It's not going to get easier this Sunday when they take on the Pittsburgh Steelers. So, while everyone's just bashing Bob and Deshaun Watson, can he do this thing without Hopkins? We got to look at just this absolutely monstrous usage that David Johnson's been getting. 95% snaps last week. That was with Duke Johnson out with a knee injury, but we saw in week 1, even when Duke was healthy, they are funneling all the touches to David Johnson they can handle. It makes sense. They traded DeAndre Hopkins, one of the icons of their franchise, in part for this guy. We should have known that O'Brien was going to feed him all the touches he can handle. That has been the case so far. Would have had a touchdown last week with a better ball on a wheel route from Watson. So he looks good out there. Even when he was healthy over the past 2 years, he wasn't really breaking tackles at a high rate at all. That has changed in 2020. Looking loose, looking good. I think the best days for this Texans offense are still to come. And yeah, again, just hellacious start to the season, and moving forward, the Texans get the Vikings, Jaguars, Titans, Packers, Jaguars, and Browns going into mid-November. So I think you're going to want to have Texans all over the fantasy squad for that stretch.
Yeah, love that take there, Ian. I think that Deshaun Watson is actually an interesting guy right now. People are down on him, and I think that he's attainable with people scared of that matchup this week. But then you look at the schedule, it's like, wow, this guy could be smooth sailing. But enough talk about, redraft. We want to talk about the upcoming game, Thursday Night Football. We got the Dolphins and the Jags. It's going to be a great game. Looking forward to it. But, obviously we have Kevin and Ian on here, and we're going to talk about DFS. Kevin's obviously the mastermind behind all the showdown analysis. So we'll start with you, Kevin. What are your thoughts on this game and DFS thoughts?
Yeah, the initial numbers here point to a couple of different potential targets, especially in that captain slot. The captain slot, just generally from a macro perspective, you like pass catchers there. And Devontae Parker looks like really an potentially undervalued option. He's had some hamstring issues. I think that could get people off of him. Some of his numbers have been depressed because of that, but he really looks like the leading wide receiver there. There were some questions about how Preston Williams would come into the mix. He looks a little bit slow to develop. So I think Parker really has that role. And if you think about this particular game facing the Jaguars, CJ Henderson has been pretty good as a rookie. He was mostly good week 1, but he's going to be up and down. They also have Trey Herndon is their other cornerback, and he has just not been a quality player for many years here. So this is a pretty juicy matchup. And you have, of course, Fitzmagic is fantasy goodness for these wide receivers. He loves throwing the ball to Devontae Parker. This is a game, surprisingly, where they still are an underdog as a couple points down to the Jaguars. So it's not like they're going to be running out the clock by any stretch of the imagination. I think all of those things point to Devontae Parker potentially having a very high-end outcome. So he would be the guy that I would prioritize for getting exposure to as a captain for this showdown contest.
Absolutely love it. Ian, what about you?
Yeah, I'm looking at the alpha, supposed to be the alpha number one wide receiver on the other side. Happy Chark week, everybody. I think DJ Chark will get going this week. It's been rough so far. Not his performance. He's caught literally every single target thrown his way, but he is tied for fourth on the Jaguars in targets through 2 weeks. Gardner Minshew likes to spread the ball around. It's a great thing to have your real life quarterback do that, but in fantasy football land, not as ideal for that said quarterback's number one wide receiver. So hasn't been great, but that same talent that we saw, really burst on the scene last year has been out there. I mean, under 8 yards after the catch ability. I mean, anytime you throw the ball up, that 6'4" monster has a chance to come down with it. Facing a Dolphins secondary where it sounds like Byron Jones isn't even going to be out there. And then Xavier Howard was so banged up last week that Flores didn't even feel comfortable asking him to shadow after Byron Jones had to leave the game. So, couldn't ask for a better matchup. Just got roasted by Josh Allen. The Bills mentioned that earlier. And I just think Chark is too good to be quiet for this long. I mean, Keelan Cole has been the number one guy there for now, but maybe I'm wrong, but I would be shocked if after 16 games that Chark doesn't emerge as the number one wide receiver in this offense by a good mark. I think this Thursday night will be his coming out party of sorts for 2020.
All right, DJ Chark. And for me, I got a couple sneaky guys. I like dabbling in those big tournaments, trying to take down, tons of money. So for me, an interesting captain is Myles Gaskin on the Miami Dolphins. We talked about having pass catchers, and he's been one of the more efficient running backs involved in the passing game. He has a second highest target share among running backs, right around 15.5%. And he's ran fewer routes only than Christian McCaffrey, Ezekiel Elliott, and David Johnson. So again, a guy that not many people have been talking about. Again, we didn't know that he was going to be the bell cow back essentially for the Miami Dolphins, but the last 2 weeks he's played ahead of Matt Breida. He's played ahead of Jordan Howard. So Myles Gaskin is an interesting spot, especially considering the Jaguars defense has been pretty vulnerable against the running back position in the passing game, allowing the third most receptions, targets, and receiving yards to running backs so far throughout 2020. And then one interesting name to throw out as well as a guy potentially to put in the flex, Tyler Eifert. So he basically was not used at all in week 1, but in week 2, his usage spiked insanely. He led the team in air yards, tight end, so over DJ Chark, and he actually leads the team in air yards through the first 2 weeks, just based on his week 2 production. And he also saw 3 end zone targets. He only caught 1 touchdown, but looking at those end zone targets, looking at the air yards, that's something that is really predictive for us when we're looking at it. And I can't imagine a lot of people are going to be on a guy like Tyler Eifert, who going into the season, we all kind of thought was dust.
You want to get rid of me and get back to more great PFF YouTube content? All you have to do is push that button right there and subscribe. Thanks for watching.